And now I'd like to introduce my friend and my very special guest, Tharik Hussain. So Tharik is an award-winning author, historian, travel writer, and fellow at the Centre of Religion and Heritage at the University of Groningen in Netherlands.
Nobody can pronounce it right.
How do I say it?
Groningen. Even I'm doing it wrong. So.
And he specialises in Muslim heritage and culture, so we have a lot in common. And his new book, Muslim Europe, a journey in search of a 1400-year-old history, was published in December. And it's published by Viking, which is part of Penguin Random House. And it's been a huge success, and Tharik's been travelling across the country, speaking about the book, and also been doing lots of talks on social media and things like that. William Dalrymple, amongst many others, but William Dalrymple says that the book nudges us to remember the massive debt that Europe owes the Muslim world. So we're going to be going into much more detail about the book today, but Tharik's previous book, which I interviewed him about, is one of them is Minarets in the Mountain, A Journey into Muslim Europe, which touches on similar themes, and it has won several awards and accolades, including being longlisted for the 2021 Baillie Gifford Prize, and it won the British Guild of Travel Writers Adele Evans Award for Best Travel Narrative Book of 2022. Tharik has authored also several travel guides. Some of you may have read them, from Lonely Planet, including Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Thailand, London, and Great Britain. And in the latter, he wrote the first chapter ever to appear in a mainstream guidebook dedicated to Muslim heritage in Britain, because people are starting to recognise this slowly, but it is getting a bit more into the mainstream. So Tharik has written about encountering Muslim cultures and heritage across the globe for various media publications, from the National Geographic to the BBC, and his writing often serves to counter popular religious and cultural narratives. And in July 2019, he created Britain's first Muslim heritage trails in Surrey, and in 2017 he was named one of the UK's most inspiring British Bangladeshis, and in 2016 his BBC World Service radio documentary America's Mosques, A Story of Integration, won the Best Religious Programme at the New York Festival World's Best Radio Programme Awards. So as I said before, Tharik has given lectures, talks and keynotes for his specialisms in many prestigious institutes and venues. And he has also contributed to a number of academic publications, including the Bloomsbury Handbook of Religion and Heritage in Contemporary Europe, and frequently lectures on the Muslim heritage of Europe. So Tharik is an advisor to various religious and cultural institutes across the globe, and he possesses 2 decades of experience in media and education. He's also a leading consultant on global Muslim culture, heritage and travel. So I've been following Tharik's work for some time and reading his books and articles, and we've also, I've interviewed you on several occasions, which has been really interesting and eye-opening. And I'm always struck by his commitment to uncovering and sharing the history of Islam in Europe and its living legacy, because it's not easy, and there's some really harsh pushback on it, so to keep going is just a credit to him. So his work is incredibly needed now, I think, more than ever, and his writing is also incredibly accessible. So when I interviewed you the first time, I think on YouTube, and I asked you, like, you know, do you want to go further academically and do a PhD and all of this, but you said that it's really needed now to have voices that can speak in an accessible way to people that may not always read these academic books. So both are important. But his work has a strong storytelling quality that allows readers to fully engage with and immerse themselves in complex subjects. So thank you, Tharik, for being here today. And you've had a really busy schedule. I believe this is the last of your hardback tours before you have a bit of a
I'm going to try and have a bit of a rest, but we'll see.
And then the paperback will come out?
In November.
Okay. Yeah. So then we'll start again.
But there's another book before that as well. There's the guidebook coming out.
Okay.
It's going to be a busy autumn again.
Yes, I can imagine. So to start with, I wanted to ask you about your book in more detail. It's described by you as a culmination of a 2-decade journey into uncovering these hidden histories. Could you explain to everybody the core argument of the book and what has kept you motivated over these decades to keep trying to unearth these stories?
Sure. Yeah, so yes, absolutely. It has been more than 2 decades now. And anybody who's read the current book will know that it starts in 2003. And I picked that moment because it was so pivotal, and also because it resonates with what we're all feeling as Muslims and non-Muslims right now. With the rise in Islamophobia and anti-Muslim hate, we are again being asked, as we seem to be asked on a daily basis, to qualify our existence here almost. And this is what I was feeling in a post-9/11 and a post-7/7 world. And actually the incident that I describe is out in Cyprus, of course. I'm on my way migrating to Saudi Arabia, or on the verge of migrating, because I've become convinced as well of this rhetoric. But one of the things that happens, of course, on that journey is that part of the reason I'm leaving starts to dismantle. It starts to unravel, because one of the reasons I'm leaving is because not only am I being told I don't belong here, I'm also convinced there is nothing Islamic in Europe. Because up until that point, my popular understanding of what it means to be European does not involve the 1400-year Muslim history that I then go on to explore. We're on our way to Saudi Arabia for what you might call a recce. In those days, you couldn't just turn up in Saudi Arabia, you had to be on a pilgrimage, or you had to be on a business visa. And I wasn't going to get a business visa. We had relatives in Saudi Arabia. I was pretending I wasn't pretending, because I did do the Umrah, but I was using the Umrah as a way to then be smuggled into Jeddah. And that's literally what had to happen, people. If you don't know the situation, you couldn't leave a certain perimeter. So I was smuggled out of, my family and I were smuggled out of Makkah to go and visit Jeddah. This was our recce. But to get there, being very broke, still kind of finishing my education, I could only afford a really cheap Cyprus Air ticket. And the fact that Cyprus Air no longer exists tells you everything you need to know. Now, in order for the price to be that cheap, I had to put up with a 9-hour layover in a place that I'd never heard of, I knew nothing about, except that it was in Cyprus, called Larnaca. And at the time, my eldest, she can't have been more than a year old, so the prospect of spending 9 hours in an airport the size of a cowshed with a toddler was terrifying. So we started to look for things to do. And one of the things that I came across, this was before the internet was any good, so a combination of maybe some website that was constantly buffering and some books, because that's really where you find things. I came across this description of a mosque just outside the town of Larnaca called the Hala Sultan Tekke and Masjid. But it was the description. I knew nothing at this point. The description was a mosque overlooking salt lakes, which just sounded, very, very romantic and, wonderfully delicious maybe from a touristic perspective. And my own ignorance meant even when I turned up at the mosque, I didn't know I was looking at an Ottoman mosque. I didn't know anything at this point in terms of my own history and as well as the history of the area. And where I was theologically at that point in time as well, when I stumbled upon what was a tomb, imagining it was in the mosque, this put me out as well. Because at that point, my own position Islamically, or my own understanding, meant these are things that I wasn't too comfortable with. So my wife and I made a quick exit with our toddler and headed back, thinking we really don't need to be in this weird place. But the elderly guide handed me this booklet in English, which I'd stuffed into my bag and not read. And it was only when I was later sitting in Saudi Arabia as a very frustrated teacher, realizing this is not the promised land at all, far from it, that I flipped open this booklet and nearly fell off my chair to realize that the place I'd been staring at, the place I'd run away from, scared that this was some bizarre, bid'ah, as the Salafis would say, going on, could be the final resting place of an actual aunt of the Prophet Muhammad in Europe. So you can imagine at this point I am completely like flabbergasted by this news. Not only am I realizing that Muslims have a history in Europe, but it goes back to the very first generation of Muslims. In fact, it goes back to the family. So what is this? What is the purpose of this book? The core argument is, of course, as the title tells you, to make it very, very clear that Muslims have been here and are still here for 1400 years. I use the Islamic calendar, that's why it calculates to 1400 years. Because of course the Islamic calendar was once a European calendar as well, as was the Arabic language. But in the process of that journey, in the process of going and exploring that history over the last 2 decades, and publishing Minarets in the Mountains first, I also began to uncover, of course, why this has become hidden. All the different reasons, and I feel like I'm only kind of grasping at the tip of the iceberg. And that realization and that mapping of this history has also left me feeling really quite broken and devastated in so many ways. But at the same time, just in the same way I felt an urgency to write the Muslim history, since writing Minarets, I've realized I'm also feeling an urgency to explain why it keeps getting ignored. I'm sure those of us who are Muslim in here, or those of us who have looked at this history, have felt this frustration. Because you're wondering, well, if this is so obvious, why do you keep ignoring it? So I realise there's other things going on here. And I'm not talking about some kind of, pre-planned conspiratorial thing here. I'm just saying that things have happened, and sometimes they were intended, sometimes they were accidental, that have led to the history being deliberately and consciously left out. And as Nadia said at the beginning, when she first interviewed me, a lot of people, when I first published the book, asked me the same thing. Are you going to do anything academically and whatever? Because they think this is something that's missing in academia. But the academics amongst us know this is there. It's not a problem in the academic world. It might not be at the forefront, but most of my sources are academic sources who have already done the groundwork. The problem is the popular arena. It's the book that you pick up, and that's why in the beginning of the book I go into a rant essentially about you could turn up to Waterstones, you could turn up to Blackwell's, and of course there are many other good bookshops out there, and you could pick up any kind of history on Europe, be it a short history of Europe, be it a long history of Europe, be it by somebody who's recognised as an authority, and you'll struggle to find more than a couple of pages on 1400 years of Muslim history. And when it is, this is the most saddest thing, when it is in there, it's only described as an invasion or an alien presence. So we're talking about 1400 years of Muslim presence, still described today as something foreign, alien, and an invasive presence. And whenever I read that, I always remind people that actually Muslims are more European than white people are American. But we've never ever questioned that. And of course that's when you start to understand, well, why is this? It's about who dominates the narrative. Who writes the popular understanding of these things? Who presents the popular perceptions, and who is working in those spaces? And so then it does sometimes get a bit sinister, but I believe, and we're going to go into this later, I believe there are blind spots that have been created, which are unfortunately even in some very well-meaning individuals, and I've met many of them, because they're wonderful historians who are like, my God, why didn't I know any of this, Tharik? And obviously you then have a conversation about that. But why is it that these people don't know it? And that's because of an unconscious bias that has emerged that we're not aware of, and the blind spot that I'm sure we're going to talk about.
Yeah. So that actually leads us nicely on to the next question, which was, your book, when it came out, it was around the time of that far-right march demo last year. And there were some really, really awful things being said. It was supposed to be about immigration, anti-immigration, but it was really anti-Muslim and anything to do with Muslims. And there was this female politician, Valentina Gomez, who actually has just been refused entry to the UK recently. And she was calling Muslims rapists and killers. And there was another speaker who said, Islam does not belong in Europe. I don't know if you recall seeing this on social media.
The Belgian politician.
Yes. And I straight away just thought of your book, and I thought, this is just perfect timing, and they really need to read this. And you said in the book that Europe carries a sort of anti-Muslim DNA, which, when I'm exploring in my book, The History of Islamophobia, this is coming up a lot. So I was wondering if you could unpack that statement and how that historical framing still shapes modern attitudes towards Muslims today and Islamophobia.
Okay, so you've got to be prepared for a history lesson now, because obviously when you make a statement like that, you're not going to get away with it. You have to qualify it. So the first thing I want to make clear is it's a metaphor. I'm not talking about some kind of biological disposition here, okay, which is what some reviewers, for some bizarre reason, seem to interpret it as. Okay, what I'm talking about is when we look at what we consider to be the popular European identity, which, let's be frank, is a Western European identity. That's why when you talk about the countries in my other book, people don't even think of them as being in Europe until you tell them where they are, and then they say, oh, you mean Eastern Europe? Because of course that's a different place. Now, this is what's necessary for you to understand what I mean by this unconscious bias, which is what the DNA is alluding to. I used it deliberately to be provocative, but also to make the point that it's at the very birth of this popular Western European identity that this begins. And this goes back. You see, the term Europe, it wasn't chosen at random. Medieval and early modern elites revived the classical word Europa because it provided an older, prestigious kind of geographical label through which Christendom could be reimagined in broader civilizational terms. And it's Christendom that we're going to focus on here. And by the way, Christendom is not Christianity, just to be very, very clear now, so that nobody misinterprets this as an attack on Christianity. You see, the thing is, what happened is, early on, from the minute Muslims arrived, we see a clash between the existing Christian communities and the Muslim communities. And so the first time we hear this term being used again is by the likes of Charles Martel during the Battle of Poitiers. Some of you may be aware of this because in popular histories it's often depicted as the moment Europe is saved. And there's the famous quote by one of the post-Enlightenment historians who says, if it wasn't for that battle, if Europe hadn't won that battle, then we would be speaking Arabic in Oxford. So this is a big, big moment. And he uses the term Europeans to talk about the Christian forces. This is the first time that it's being used to exclusively describe Christian forces. Then later, during the coronation of Charlemagne, the foundations for what we begin to see emerge as Latin Christendom are laid down. Now, what is Christendom in this context? Well, it's basically a transnational political anti-Muslim community. In other words, the coming together of kingdoms that later become England, France, Italy, Germany. These are the kingdoms that are coming together, and their sole unifying thing is we are Christians who want to fight Muslims. So this is what I mean when I tell you at the core. Now, okay, you might say, well, that was then. So how does it then evolve? Well, then what happens, of course, afterwards, immediately, is the Crusades. So the Crusades begin, and that call is heard properly. So while it's being discussed early on in this way, under the banner of the Crusades, Christendom really begins to see itself as one. And the narratives begin. And these are narratives that are supported by myths and legends. Throw into the mix the Reconquista, where you have the narratives again, and of course the most famous, for those of you that know your Spanish history, is the patron saint of Spain, Matamoros, which means Muslim killer. Okay, so just take a moment to think about that. The patron saint of one of these nations, one of the defining elements of the identity for this country, was someone who was dubbed Muslim killer. This was a real person, by the way, St. James. He was a Sahaba of Isa, a companion of Jesus. But of course, in the medieval Iberian narrative, he then becomes this mythical figure who arrives on horseback during a made-up battle called the Battle of Clavijo to defeat made-up Muslims. And then what happens is, before the age of iPhone, before the digital era, before news and everything else, of course, the way in which you propagate ideas is primarily through these religious institutes, especially in deeply Catholic, deeply Muslim countries. And so every single church eventually ends up with a statue, including the Mesquita Cathedral. You can go and see it yourself. If you go to the main bit, you'll see Santiago de Matamoros on horseback trampling on Muslims. So this was the visual image that was being fed constantly. And along with it, there were other narratives that were supporting it, such as the 100 Virgin tribute. So apparently one of the reasons Matamoros turns up in order to defeat the Muslims is not just to stop their advancement, it's also to stop this humiliating thing that the Christian rulers were being made to do every year, which is send 100 virgins, 50 of noble blood, 50 of common blood, to satisfy the appetite of the depraved emirs and caliphs. It's complete nonsense. The whole thing is made up. So is the battle. And of course, so is the figure. Yes, he's a religious figure, and very rarely would I question someone's belief in something, but I'm saying here you can see what's happening here. In both of those, we have the perfect kind of, how can we put it, epitomization of how Muslims are viewed. One depicts them as being barbaric, worthy only of killing, subhuman, and the other as sexually depraved. You could be reading a Daily Mail headline. But this is how it evolved. So you have all of these things emerging throughout the early medieval period, and these mythologies, by the way, become part of the daily understanding. And other things in pop culture, for example, some of you probably may have lived near pubs that were once called the Turk's Head, the Saracen's Head, the Moor's Head. These are all reportedly, these names can go back to the Crusades, when Crusaders would come back with a trophy in hand. And that trophy was, of course, a Saracen's Head. So it's just giving you a glimpse of how these things became quite apparent. And then from the Crusade period, of course, once we see the end of the Muslim era that I cover in this book, we then have the Ottoman period. So the anti-Ottoman narrative, it then goes over to that. So we have the anti-Ottoman narratives, the myths. We obviously, because the Ottomans conquered and dominated a huge part of what we call Europe today, we also start to see at this moment the distinction between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. In that part of the Ottoman lands is what eventually becomes Eastern Europe, and this is really the reason why it still remains othered. And from a Muslim perspective, that's a deeply inconvenient thing, because that's where the indigenous European Muslims are. So that's how you prove that the narrative has never stopped. From the minute the Muslims arrived, like Haram in the 7th century, and this isn't a discussion about whether they should have been there or not. The reality is they were. And so up until the middle of the 20th century, early part of the 20th century, we see these places are still deeply pluralistic in terms of religious observance. This is why Sarajevo was dubbed as the Jerusalem of Europe. And this is a dubbing from the West. From the East, it wasn't dubbed the Jerusalem of Europe because all of those cities were like that, where people were coexisting. So you could go to any city in the Ottoman area, and it wasn't a perfect system, no one's suggesting that, but the millet system meant Muslims, Jews and Christians could relatively coexist. So you have the anti-Ottoman narratives. Following the fall of Constantinople, Christendom increasingly is starting to be replaced in the language by Europe. So we see the transition. Now it's really important to note the transition is happening whilst this anti-Muslimness is going on, while it's at the forefront of the consciousness. So it's not just a post-Enlightenment thing, which is what some people sometimes assume. And then Enlightenment happens, and Christendom is secularized into what we call European civilization by the likes of Voltaire and other great Enlightenment thinkers. And so Europe, as a civilization, is defined now by this shared history, law, philosophy, and progress, apparently instead of the religion. But of course, this new Europe, you can't just switch these things off. You can't switch off your cultural baggage. You can't switch off your cultural psychology. It carries that baggage. And this new Europe still mirrors the old map. Who are the leaders of the EU? It's those kingdoms that I told you that came together originally. It's the same leaders in the EU. And it's still mirroring the old map and memory of Christendom. The Christian Commonwealth basically did not disappear. It was just given a secular kind of tying up. Now, if you listen to what people are saying right now, like those at that demo, it never went very far into the subconscious. Because we've got people that are telling us they're going to take Europe back to Christianity. Now that in itself, when you start hearing some of the kind of narratives being spouted, it's not actually talking about taking it back to Christianity at all. And I have very good Christian friends who are horrified by this. A bit like how we feel when somebody does something horrific in the name of Islam. Because of course they're not talking about taking it back to Christianity. They're talking about taking it back to Christendom. Christianity is an inclusive faith. Jesus stood with the oppressed. He stood with the refugees. He was a refugee himself. He would be horrified if you took his name and created an exclusionary base. I can say that even as a non-Christian, I know that. So it's Christendom. Christendom was the one that wanted to eradicate every other faith in order to exist. And one of the faiths, of course, that it consistently tried to eradicate was Judaism. So the other thing this does, the other thing this eradication of the history does, you see, it also creates this horrific idea that Europe is a Judeo-Christian construct. And one of the primary reasons for that is to exclude Muslims from that narrative. And in excluding Muslims, of course, it also excludes the role Muslims have played alongside the Jewish community. And we'll go into that, of course, later on. But the way in which, so you have this development over centuries, over a millennia of this anti-Muslimness at the core. And the ways in which it's nurtured and reinforced, as well as the early polemic, which was obviously anti-Muslim, you also have the destruction of physical history in the ground and heritage. We saw it in our own lifetime in the Balkans, and as those of you that have read the book, I came across archaeologists trying to recover some of this in the book, who admitted that it had been destroyed. So it's easier to destroy, if it's destroyed then you can't claim it was there, it's more difficult. This is before the digital age, before things could be mapped. Then you're also denying Muslims, of course, the credit that they're due, both from a civilizational perspective and an intellectual perspective. And again, in the book, I show how this continuum is often broken, where the early Muslim foundational body of intelligence and work that arrived as part of the Muslim Golden Age, how later Renaissance thinkers rarely gave credit to those that they essentially got their ideas from. Some did, but that continues breaking. So this is another way in which this anti-Muslimness continues to be nurtured. Then, of course, this history over time becomes so canonized and so accepted that if you dare to challenge the idea of a Judeo-Christian history today, most people will laugh you out. If you dare to tell anybody that Islam and Muslim culture played a pivotal role in what we call modern Europe, everybody except the academics who know is going to laugh you out of the place. And this is why the book, although it's done well, it's had many challenges, especially arriving at a time like this. And so it's this combination, this long mapping, which of course is a book in itself. And I didn't want that to be this book. Because if it becomes this book, then this book is going to be perceived as polemic. Then this book is going to be perceived as an attack. So in this book, I merely plant the seed, and I make the point in the hope that others will also think, what's he talking about? What does this actually mean? Because actually, when you go looking for it, it just comes off the evidence. I didn't go looking for this. I didn't go looking for anti-Muslim DNA or whatever. I went looking for Muslim history. But this is what comes off. Anybody who's done research knows this. You go looking for one thing, loads of things turn up, start appearing off the page. They just fly off the page. And this was the big overarching thing, which I alluded to in my first book, but I wasn't quite sure. I had to go back to the beginning to see how it began. And this book took me to that beginning. Sorry, that was very long, and I apologise. That probably felt like a really dry history lesson.
No, that was really, really useful in trying to get our head around why this sort of anti-Muslim hostility, deep-rooted exists. Actually, what you just said about European thinkers taking some of that knowledge and not giving it credit, and there is a quote that I was going to say.
Go for it.
And it was about the many contributions of Muslim scholars were absorbed into European knowledge without proper recognition, as you said. And the quote was, Copernicus's example is typical of how many Christian Renaissance men credited as innovators, pioneers, and trailblazers were in truth, knowingly or unknowingly, simply plagiarists who had failed to credit their Muslim predecessors.
And to his credit, Copernicus does mention several Muslim thinkers and Muslim scientists, like Ibn Rushd. I don't think I need it, I'm a teacher. And so, to his credit, he does name it, but the reason I put him in there is because he's an example where people who later did kind of almost a forensic mapping of the ideas then came across the actual Syrian astronomer whose work first tells us that we have evidence of that actually the Earth goes around the sun. Not the other way around, as in the Ptolemaic model. But it is to this day, if you pick up a book now, you will see Copernicus is still credited with this. But it was dismantled in the 50s. And for whatever reason, and this is why I tried to give Copernicus some credit, I read it, obviously in order to talk about something, you read their life story, and came to feel quite sorry for the bloke, because he really did get it in the neck for these ideas. I tried to credit the fact that maybe the translation he was reading hadn't given credit, because most of these scholars were relying on translations. Some of them couldn't themselves access the original Arabic, and the translation work had been done in the early medieval period in Toledo, in Palermo, which we'll talk about later. And so it's quite possible that often they were reading books that manuscripts and books that hadn't given credit to the sources. It may not have been the individual himself, but of course it's a great way to make that point.
Yeah, and just to maybe just explain that a bit more. So the Muslims, especially at the golden age of Islam, did a lot of work in preserving Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge. And borrowing, and then adding bits to it. And if it wasn't for them, a lot of this work would be lost. They kept it alive, and then, as Tharik said, in places like Palermo and Toledo, there was a lot of work around from Christians and Jews in translating that then into Latin, and then that went through from those areas to the rest of Europe, and and then we say that's what led to the European Renaissance. Absolutely. When Europe was still in the Dark Ages. So just to explain that a bit more. And also, just to touch on what you said about Eastern Europe, and in Minarets in the Mountains, you talk about this a lot, like why is it called Eastern Europe? And then you said that Greece isn't considered Eastern Europe.
Even though it's further east than Eastern Europe. Have a look on the map next time you look. Greece is here, Eastern Europe is here. But this isn't Eastern Europe, because we like that Graeco-Roman stuff. Yeah. That's what we've modelled our new civilization on, you see. Exactly. So that's why. So it's about selectiveness. It's not about geography.
And that's what you said. The whole narrative around Brexit,
absolutely,
and the Eastern Europe was less about communism, but more about anti-Muslim hatred. So just to follow on and go a bit deeper into the bit about the Judeo-Christian heritage of Europe. So a key theme in your works, not just this one, but also Minarets, is that Muslims are not outsiders to Europe. And if that's one key message we take away, and that we should push back on. Muslims are not outsiders to Europe. We didn't just come in the immigration waves here in the 50s, 60s, and so on. But we are indigenous to Europe, and this is what you keep repeating. And here in the UK as well, there's so many influences from Islam for centuries, and not just in recent history. So when you say that you're uncomfortable with this purely Judeo-Christian heritage narrative, and we hear this repeatedly from political leaders, not just here, but across the US and other parts of Europe, and it just feels like we're written out of history entirely, and many Muslims buy into that, and we will also think, like you said, you went on your own journey of belonging, and so did I, that, when we don't really, let's just keep our heads down, we don't really belong here, you internalize a lot of these messagings, and then you're not really being your full self. And so I wanted to ask you, what your work shows that Islamic civilization has had a deep, deep and profound impact on shaping Europe. Muslims at their height brought advanced societies, advanced civilization and culture. So not just the faith element and ritual elements, but changed societies, created sustainable living, the way buildings were made and cities were made was so futuristic, we should learn from some of this right now. And what I found just interesting, I was trying to just get my head around it, is that the denial of any sort of Muslim heritage in Europe and being indigenous to Europe. I mean, I've had so much pushback when I write about it, like real horrible hate speech. And it triggers some people, not everybody, but it really deeply triggers people. And this links into maybe that, you know, that DNA thing that you spoke about. So while Islam, we know, has shaped a great deal of European society, you know, the Renaissance and everything, and European identity then was constructed in opposition to Islam, like you said.
The popular one, yeah.
Yeah, so for me, that's just a juxtaposition, really. Like, you deny it, but if you look deep, things like, I don't know, I've observed this, but things like when I go to European countries, there's just a lot of pork, like excessively to when you go anywhere else. And that's one example. And then in Spain, there used to be these festivals where they would be killing the Saracens and reenacting it and stuff like that. So I was wondering if you could explain a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that, obviously, that you said at the beginning that frustrates me is this idea of Judeo-Christian heritage. Now, the reason this frustrates me is because anyone that knows their European history, be they Jew, Muslim, Christian or otherwise, it's deeply insulting to suggest that historically Jews and Christians had some cozy alliance in Europe, because that's what the term says. And this, anybody that's looked into this, by the way, is a post-World War II 20th century construction. And it's developed to exclude Muslims on the one hand, and it's developed to create this kind of narrative for people in places like the US and Australia that, you know, we are sitting on the foundations of this great Judeo-Christian heritage. Well, firstly, the anti-Muslim DNA, this is why I use the term DNA, if we use it as a metaphor, and we talk about it as being something that is passed on generationally, we can see that it's been passed on to our colonies as well. Because we see it in America, we see it in Australia, and we see it in the other colonies that we all know only too well. And so that DNA has gone abroad as well, is the first point that I want to make. And this is why we hear you know, people like Trump openly denigrating Muslim cultures, talking about wiping out entire civilizations that are Muslim, because they mean nothing to him. This is nothing, you know. This is the Antichrist in his head. And so the reason I get so insulted or feel insulted and feel so angry when I hear this Judeo-Christian element is not just because of how exclusionary it is to Muslim heritage in Europe, which of course, if anything, it's Abrahamic. When you start unpicking where the foundations of modern Western European civilization come from, it is 100% Abrahamic plus the pre-Abrahamic, you know, ideologies and faiths, be they pagan or otherwise. But if you look at the history of Jews and Christians in Europe, it is exclusively, almost, up until the Enlightenment, a murderous one. And it's one side trying to extinguish the other. From the 1st century onwards, we see Jews again and again in Europe being massacred. The Visigoths, who of course were in Spain just before the Muslims arrived, they were forcibly converting the Jews. They were burning them alive when they found out they were still crypto-Jews. They were basically confiscating their property and just claiming it. It's no wonder the Jews felt so great when the Muslims popped over, and we'll go to that later. You know, you start then looking at the Crusades. The Crusades was about fighting the Muslims, but there was another non-Christian entity right in front of them. So before, on their way to fighting the Christians, they would often murder the Jews along the way. So there are things like the Rhineland massacre in Mainz, in Cologne. All of these are very well documented. I'm not telling you anything new here. This country alone. This country, not many people know this because we don't talk about it. This country was the first kingdom to expel Jews. In 1290, the Edict of Expulsion, go and look it up. We were the first, I'm saying we because I live here. I didn't personally have anything to do with it. We were the first to expel Jews. You are not allowed here. Okay? And they didn't come back until the 17th century, and even then it was informal and hidden and what have you. Okay? Then comes the Black Death, of course. Again and again, you see the Jews are blamed for the Black Death. In places like Strasbourg and Basel, horrific. They were rounded up in wooden houses that were then set alight. This is what was happening between Christians and Jews. Even in places like the kind of Polish-Lithuanian duchy that is often presented as, oh, there was this wonderful coexistence here. That turned nasty as well. During the Reformation, you have people like Martin Luther talking about the Jews should have been extinguished. And I could go on, segregated, stigmatized, all throughout the early medieval period. In fact, there's a moment in the 15th century, not a moment, but the moment when the Jews and Muslims are expelled from Iberia. Jewish historians like Jane Gerber, for example, will tell you, nowhere in Western Europe, except for tiny pockets in Italy and Germany, was safe for Jews. So in that moment, the Jews could only go to Muslim lands. And of course, those of you that have read my earlier book will know there's a legend that Sultan Bayezid II, the Ottoman Sultan, sends his entire naval fleet to collect the refugee Jews. And this is how Sephardic Judaism makes an appearance across Muslim Balkan Europe. And the other Muslim lands they go to is the Maghreb in North Africa. And so the narrative of this protection or offering protection or offering refuge isn't just an early one in Al-Andalus, which is what we often get told. It continues. In the early Muslim European period, the one that I cover in the book, we have effectively a liberation. I'm not saying this, these are Jewish historians' words. If you read the Jewish historians' words, when Tharik ibn Ziyad comes across, it doesn't read. If you read Jewish historian and Muslim historians' version of this, it's not depicted as a conquest. It's actually depicted as a liberation. And there are some suggestions that the Jews played a part in helping them come over. Now, of course, later on that's difficult because you can't prove it. And also, secondly, the Christians would have really turned on them if it could have been proven. So this is another reason it's difficult. But what we do know is this. Historians, Muslim historians and Jewish historians all accept that every time Tharik ibn Ziyad and his army of tiny men, tiny group of men, not tiny men, group of men, took a town or a city, the reason they could go to the next one quickly, and the reason they could take such a huge peninsula so quickly, was because they would leave a Jewish garrison behind. Now, if I'm here to conquer something, if I'm here to take the Maqam center, if I've just met you, I'm not going to leave you in charge before I go to my next conquest. It's taken me so much work to get this wonderful jewel, to earn this great entity. So that in itself tells you that this was a collaboration of sorts. And of course, what then happens is, and this again gets framed completely differently when mentioned at all, the Jewish Golden Age happens. Not just one, according to some two. Now, we do hear about the Jewish Golden Age, but almost never is it framed as something that happened in Muslim Europe. And that's where it happened. It happened in the 10th century in the Caliphate of Cordoba, and then later on in the 12th century during the Zirid and Nasrid Granada periods. This is when we see people like Hasdai bin Shaprut, Maimonides, Samuel ibn Nagrila, all these great individuals. We see a cultural flourishing that has rarely been witnessed since. The foundations of Hebrew to then become a living spoken language are first laid here. The most beautiful poetry, the most beautiful music. So much of it takes place during this period. And of course the way in which it's framed in this part of the world, if it's mentioned at all, because it's, to mention it you have to concede the Muslims had a role to play, right? It's very rarely mentioned. When it is mentioned, it's always qualified, but they were dhimmis, they were paying tax, and it's like this golden age took place under duress. I don't know about you, but I've never heard of a golden age taking place under duress. If you're under duress, you're not going to be singing, dancing, creating culture. And of course, this is all relative. If we start projecting our standards of civilization and the concept of nationality and citizenship back every time, we're really going to struggle to give merit to anybody. But this is somewhere where merit should be given, without any shadow of a doubt. And it's not Muslim historians that give this merit. You can read the Jewish historians' books. They all give merit to this period. In fact, most of the Jewish historians talk about this in the most romantic of ways. Even now, if you go to Cordoba and you visit these spaces, when I was interviewing the guy who runs the Casa de Sefard, which is the Sephardic Jewish synagogue Jewish museum in Cordoba, he says one of the biggest problems is Jews come here and romanticize too much about it. That's how it's viewed. It's viewed as a legitimate golden age. And the fact that it took place in Muslim Europe is one of the reasons it's also left out of our popular understanding of what European history is. But coming back to the idea of a cozy Judeo-Christian alliance, even when we go to the later period, we have people like Bayezid potentially bringing the Jewish community across so that they can continue to live in Europe. Otherwise, according to Gerber, at this moment in time, European Jewry could have been extinguished. There was really nowhere else to go. It would have been a minority cult. So apparently, they turn up in the Ottoman lands, and of course, we see cities like I can rarely pronounce it, the Greek one, Thessaloniki, now called Saloniki, Sarajevo, other towns like this where they flourish, actively flourish. In fact, the Greek city becomes majority Jewish, and it stays that way until the early 20th century. So right up until the early 20th century, Europe's Jews are still flourishing, more or less, in Muslim Europe lands. But this is rarely a part of our understanding of what this means. They're flourishing in medicine, trade, diplomacy, finance. And those of you that have read this history know the Muslims that are living beside them are also embracing this. In the early 20th century, when the Nazis come to steal all the Jewish artifacts in Sarajevo, one of the most precious ones, the Sarajevo Haggadah, is saved by Darwish Korkut, a Bosnian Muslim. He risks his own life to save this. Then he goes and saves a young Jewish girl as well. The Haggadah actually is almost stolen again when the Serbs attack. And again a Muslim saves it. If Muslims and Jews were eternal enemies, this is why this frustrates me so much right now. Because you know the narrative. Especially in the context of what's happened recently. You know the narrative that is being flung at us. Apparently we hate each other, and we always have. Every day you will read on social media that, Islam has an anti-Semitic problem. Excuse me, if you look at Islamic history, it's probably the only Abrahamic faith that doesn't display that consistently. Of course there were exceptions. I'm not pretending this was some romantic, golden, rose-tinted, entire history. The Almohads came, they were deeply intolerant. Maimonides himself had to escape them. But where does he go? He goes to a more tolerant Muslim land. So of course there were despots, of course, but they were the exception. We are now being told they were the rule. And this is what the most terrifying thing is. Because how different, I want to ask you this, how different would we feel today with everything that's gone on globally and on our own doorstep if Muslims and Jews knew their collective history in Europe properly? Because one of the saddest things I learned along the way is that it's not just me who doesn't know this history. There are young Jews who do not get taught this. I interviewed an Israeli guide who was out there with me. He was my tour guide in Toledo. He studied in Israel. And I said to him, "Oh, you must be out here because you found your wonderful Sephardic history." He said, "No, I wasn't taught any of this. This wasn't a part of my education. It was a shock to me. I followed a woman here. He was in love. He followed his girlfriend. Then he comes here and people tell him about this Jewish history." And I said, "So you studied in Israel, but you were not taught about this." So it's not just an issue for us. It's when it's absent from the popular understanding, everybody is a victim of it. Sorry, it's almost stuck to me. I was going, so.
It seems to be a popular theme to sort of erase the history. I just wanted to pick up on that. In the book, you talk about specifically places, not just Andalusia, which we always hear about, but also Sicily, Malta, Gozo, the island of Gozo, Portugal, and obviously Cyprus, which was the place that the Muslims first came. And you talk about this sort of coexistence and mutual respect at times. And there's an interesting story of a tombstone of a Sicilian Christian woman called Anna. And this is dating 1148. And there's inscriptions on there in 4 different languages, including Arabic. So there's buildings, there's a synagogue you mentioned, and Christian buildings that have Arabic inscriptions. And it was seen to be like an example of how we have lived and we can live. And if we knew more of this history, I think it could go a long way in boosting community relations and feelings of belonging, and it could only really improve society, in my view. And I wanted to ask you specifically about Cordoba. So in the famous Cordoba mosque, the Mezquita, which then after the Muslims lost the land, it got turned into a church. But yet there are still Arabic inscriptions on there. and the architecture is distinctly Umayyad with the horseshoe arches, which then got copied across Europe, and I think you can even see it here in the UK, like St Pancras.
Well, if you look at some modern, pretty recent Jewish synagogues, you'll find them. So if anybody's been to Manchester, next time you go and visit the Manchester synagogue, which is now the Manchester Museum of Judaism, and it is an ode to Al-Andalus.
Yeah.
You'll see horseshoe arches. When you go into the main bit, the ark is kept under a horseshoe arch, because this was also in their memory. It was a golden age.
Yeah, and it's
a period to be celebrated.
And you do see it replicated. And then you speak about the poet philosopher, the Indian Muslim poet. Oh, perfect. So Muhammad Iqbal, who died in 1938, and you said he was going through his journey as well of going more outside of pure nationalism to more a Islamic outlook, a unified Islamic outlook, and partly his trip to Europe did a lot in solidifying that. And then he went to the Mesquita, and you said he was the first person to be able, luckily, to pray there in over 700 years. And it brought up so many emotions for him that he wrote his famous poem, Masjid al-Qurtaba, and he sort of laments, but also feels pride in this Islam that was in Europe, in Andalusia, but all across the Muslim world. And he reflects and says, the Spanish people, they still have this Muslim kind of like DNA, he says. So I just wanted to know, before you do your reading, is because you weren't allowed to pray there, and I think they're quite strict now, which is a total opposite to how the land used to be of coexistence. What emotions did it bring up for you when you visited it and were not able to maybe pray or just to see it as it is now?
Well, to be honest, I think a lot of those emotions are going to be reflected in the passage. So if I read that, I could then talk you through it. And I think, you're also going to sense a few other things going on, and then I'll tell you a bit about the historicity around the Mesquita today, and not just the Mesquita, but other places as well. When the Pakistani scholar and poet Muhammad Iqbal visited the Mesquita in 1932, he became the first Muslim in almost 700 years to pray in the iconic Mesquita Cathedral. Black and white photos show a 55-year-old mustachioed Iqbal kneeling on a patterned prayer mat and wearing a fez hat in front of the mosque's iconic and glorious mihrab. In another picture, he is standing beneath its horseshoe arch, looking pensive as he leans on his walking stick. It was an emotional and powerful visit for the aging Muslim polymath, who became so overwhelmed by the magnitude and significance of Europe's first great mosque, its only caliphate mosque, and the culture and society it once served, that it inspired him to pen one of his greatest poems, Masjid al-Qurtaba, an elegant meditation on love, using the mosque as an object of that love. In the poem, considered a masterpiece, he says the haram of Cordoba owes its existence to love. By using the term haram, Iqbal was elevating the great mosque to the realms of Masjid al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, Masjid al-Nabawi in Medina, and the Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. In doing so, he might well be accused of being drunk on his love for the Mesquita Cathedral, maybe even blaspheming for equating it, like the Cypriots and Hada Sultan, with the three holiest mosques in Islam, each with an explicit link to the Prophet Muhammad and the founding narrative of the faith. But these were the words of a great intellect who had the soul of a great poet. I had visited Cordoba so many times in the past, armed with all the literary outpourings Western writers had to offer, from travel narratives by Jason Webster to histories written by W. Montgomery Watt and John Gill. but none of them understood what it meant to step into this space as a Muslim. How could they? Only the words of Iqbal came close. As we entered the courtyard of the Oranges, to our right was the mosque's minaret, now the church's bell tower, from which the 9th century local polymath, Abbas ibn Firnas, first launched himself in an attempt to fly, using a kind of primitive hang glider. The experiment failed, and somehow Ibn Firnas walked away unscathed. Known in the Latin world as Arman Firman, Ibn Firnas would eventually achieve flight at the ripe old age of 70, when dressed in a bird-like suit made from silk and eagle feathers, he would fly for around 10 minutes from the top of a hill, close to Abdurrahman I's summer palace, Ar-Rusafa, to the northwest of the city. Born in about 810, Ibn Firnas was a typical Cordoban. He was also a poet, astrologer, musician, astronomer, and engineer, and almost certainly the first human being to experience flight, more than 600 years before the Renaissance man, Leonardo da Vinci, merely drew a similar contraption in his famous notebook. And over 1,000 years before the Wright brothers took to the air. Ibn Firnas also invented a technique for making colourless glass, a number of glass planispheres, corrective lenses, a kind of primitive metronome, a water clock, and a process for cutting rock crystal. Had he been born 500 years later, a Christian, in Spain, he might also have been revered today as a Renaissance man. Approaching the entrance to the Mesquita, I told Yusuf about my experience on a previous visit with a group of childhood friends from the East End of London, all of South Asian descent and all visibly Muslim. The security guard looked a little panicked when he saw us walking up to the entrance, I said, making Yusuf laugh. How many of you were there? He asked. There were 5 of us. Only 5, and he was scared. Look around, how many of us are here? I said, pointing to the handful of late middle-aged white tourists milling around beneath the orange trees, each planted in its own neat little circular bed and linked to others by smart irrigation channels. Like us, they had read their guidebook and picked up on the tip to save money by entering the Mesquita free of charge before morning mass. He kept telling us we couldn't pray in there. We told him we didn't intend to, I said. But it was like he didn't believe us and kept repeating his point and wouldn't let us pass until one of my more conservative friends got a tad agitated and said, "We don't pray in churches." What did he say? Okay. I think he was happy we considered it a church and not a mosque. I laughed. Yusuf shook his head in dismay. We were now near the front of the queue. "Musulmano?" asked the security guard as soon as he caught sight of us. I ignored him and smiled at Yusuf. "Muslim?" he said, assuming my silence suggested I didn't know what Musulmano meant. "Yes," I replied, in the same tone I use when running out of patience with my 5-year-old. Yusuf and I both knew exactly what was coming. The security guard peered over his glasses to make sure there was eye contact. "No, pray here. No, pray inside," he said. This was a very different welcome to the one Muhammad Iqbal received. Somehow, the Indo-Pakistani mystic had convinced the authorities to let him pray in there. Things had changed a lot since the 1930s.
Thank you. Did you want to reflect on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, obviously the reason I picked the passage was to show some of the complexities. Because sometimes people will say, "Oh, but there's the Mesquita, there's the Alhambra, you have so much heritage left." It's complete and utter nonsense. Because firstly, the more you start looking into this and the more you begin to realize that has been eradicated, the sadder you get. Because this book would be so much easier to write if I didn't have to also be a detective. This book would be so much easier to sell to people if I had so many more places that were the Alhambra or the Mesquita to talk about. We don't. Even when we have them, like the Mesquita Cathedral and the Alhambra, just to use those 2 examples, when we visit them, and I'm sure many of you have, we are still looking at them through Eurocentric lens. Because the gatekeepers are still not people who see it for what it really is. And so my point of putting Iqbal in, not just because I'm a great fan of his, who isn't, it's also to make the point that it was a Muslim intellectual poet outside of the Eurocentric glare that made me realise what a Muslim should feel when they stand in that place. And this was 20 years after I started visiting it. And I've been going almost every other year. It literally became a pilgrimage for me. I would go there, then I would go to the Alhambra, then I'd go to other places. And so there's that aspect of it. The other aspect is the gatekeepers. So as you heard, there's someone aggressively reminding you it's not a mosque. They're going even further now. Over the 20 years I've been going, I've watched it change as the tussle continues. So there are local non-Muslim activists and organisers and organisations who are fighting this. But for some reason the local Spanish Catholic Church is aggressively trying to rewrite the history as something that is Christian-centric. So every year I've gone, I've seen the Christian segment within the museum continue to expand and expand and expand. First time I went, it wasn't even there. Now it's a whole museum inside the mosque. Now I don't have a problem with that, but we need equity and balance. And I'm not telling you this. UNESCO is telling you this. The reason the mosque is a UNESCO World Heritage Site is because of its Caliphate period. It says it quite clearly. And these activists are often having to go to UNESCO and basically tell them this is what the church is doing. And then the church has to relent. And this has been going on. So if somebody doesn't do it, they will just continue to do this. At one point during my series of visits, Google took off Mesquita from the name because the church had done so. And so then they naturally put pressure on the mosque, on Google to remove it as well. Oh, it's not a mosque cathedral, it's a cathedral, you know. And so this is the tussle that we're not just experiencing. There is this wonderful, wonderful synagogue, and I urge you all to go and see it, in Toledo. There's two actually wonderful ones, but this one is called El Transito. If I put up a picture of it up here, you would think it was the Sheikh Abu Zaid Mosque in Abu Dhabi. It's just pure snow-white horseshoe arches. Everybody looks at it and thinks immediately it's a mosque. And they did for a long, long time. It's actually a synagogue. And it's known as the El Transito, but probably originally called the Ibn Shoshan because they believe that's who paid for it. The same thing is going on there. The Sephardic Jews are saying, this was taken illegally. This is ours. You should let us have it back as a cultural space for coexistence. And again, the church is refusing. So you have this tussle, firstly, you know, who now owns this heritage and how do they decide to depict it? And then you have the misrepresentation. So if you go to the Alhambra, how many of you have been to the Alhambra? Just out of curiosity. Okay, so if you go to the Alhambra, I'm sure if you haven't done like tons of other reading, some of us here probably will because, you know, we want to know about the Muslim history. But most people that turn up haven't. So they turn up and they either pick up the guide or they wander around where there's nothing written. And they walk away thinking it's some kind of sex palace, a pleasure palace. Because if you do listen to the guide, if you do pick up the original the material that they encourage you to, it's these projections of 18th and 19th century notions of what the Alhambra was. So you're supposed to listen out for the giggling houris in the haram. You're supposed to look out for that bloke that was cheating on Abdul's wife under the tree that's been cut off. All this nonsense. And this is largely the result of books like Tales of the Alhambra by Washington Irvine, who made the Alhambra popular again in the European mindset. But what's really, really sad is, if you actually start looking at the Alhambra, and you start comparing it to other Muslim buildings of contemporaneous period, the closest resemblance to much of the Alhambra are madrasas. So if you go to the University of Al-Qayrawan in Fez, and you stand in that courtyard, you will see the Alhambra. It's the same plan. It's the same architecture. If you go to the madrasa in Marrakesh, I forget off the top of my head, it's the same plan. And here's the killer. The only document that has ever survived where we know something actually took place in the Alhambra, because all of it got destroyed by the way, is a document that tells us that a Mawlid happened there. Now for those of you that don't know, the Mawlid is the celebration of the Prophet's birth. Now it's true that a lot of Muslims don't observe it, but those that do consider it to be one of the most deeply religious moments in the entire calendar. So one of the most significant religious events that can take place in the Islamic calendar is the only evidence we have of something happening in the Alhambra. Plus, everywhere you look, there's Quran. Everywhere you look, there's Quran. Can you imagine a space with biblical passages, or a space with passages from the Torah, and people calling it a sex palace? But this is what's happening, because of course, as I said to you earlier, with the myths and narratives, these are the ways in which Muslims are perceived. You know, we're either sexually depraved or barbaric. And this is the dichotomy that's presented all the time, again and again. And so even when there are spaces, it's about who is telling us what this space means. And in the book, I speak with some people randomly, and people might be thinking, you know, if you're a serious researcher, why are you just talking to someone in the Alhambra? Because that's how you learn what people think of this place. The poor woman thought it was something out of Bollywood. Even that threw me. That was the first time I'd heard that as well, by the way. I was like, wow, you really haven't bothered to look up anything. You didn't Google it, did you? But what she meant was, you see, the Mughal architecture, the delicacy of it, the style of it, that's what it felt like to her. That's what she was saying. But even then, she didn't think it was Islamic. It was 2/3 of the way into the tour, and she still didn't know it was a Muslim building. No, this is not a reflection of her intellect. A lot of people wander through just Instagramming the hell out of it and then walking off.
Yes.
Because they think that this is just some weird Spanish space.
Well, I was going to ask you that exact same thing, that you were critiquing the audio guides, and we've all felt the same when you visit these places of interest from different parts of the Muslim world, or even in places in Europe, and you're just told that same barbaric harem narrative, and you just refuse to sort of listen to it now.
It's taken straight out of the Arabian Nights playbook, isn't it? And when you look at the Arabian Nights, that is another another strand that has nurtured all of this, because the Arabian Nights was translated by a bloke who pretended to be Muslim in order to disguise himself and get into Makkah. He then comes out and tells the world he's translated something which he didn't translate from the original. He translated it from European text. He embellished it, and on every other picture he put a naked woman. If I was a Victorian and I had never been to Arabia, and I picked up that book, I'm conscious there are children here, I do apologise, sorry, I just realised. Okay, and I had never been to Arabia, and I picked up that book. Firstly, I would think there were genies everywhere, but secondly, I'd expect to find women topless everywhere. I'm being serious. I handled first editions as part of my most recent heritage project. Picture after picture of naked women. Yeah. I don't even know how it's connected to the narrative most of the time. But this is, and by the way, Sir Richard Burton, Francis Burton, just in case you think he's an actor, is just part, like the tip of the iceberg. This is just one person who, translated this, and then he also translated The Perfumed Garden, which is considered a sex manual of the Muslims. Then he translates the Kama Sutra, which again is considered a sex manual of South Asians. And if you've read anything recently about people decolonizing that, they're outraged. And so this is the way in which obviously these projections were not only instigated, but then continue to be reinforced and nurtured, actively nurtured, so they become even more powerful.
You also said that when you go into these spaces and turn off your Eurocentric radar, then a whole different history presents itself, because we also can go with that as well. And it's there, it's present, but you don't always notice it, or you're influenced by the narratives that we've had to grow up with. So I wanted to open up to the floor for questions. Does anybody want to go first? Question for Tharik? Saladin?
So how deliberate is this erasure of Muslims from popular narrative? Because it seems that we're often constructed as the other. Because these are kind of things you could find with Google search.
Yeah.
But at school...
Some bits in Wikipedia, yeah, of course.
Yeah, Wikipedia. But it seems your average Joe has no idea. And is that deliberate? Because, for example, you see, like, these far-right marches, a lot of Twitterati kind of like racists, whatever, you don't know some of these basic facts.
I mean, we're talking about Nia, How do you establish niyat for anything? You can only look at what the impact is, and we can only talk about the impact. Now, of course, in some cases, the niyat is explicit. The intention is explicit. When the Pope is telling you that the Muslims are the devil, then clearly that's an intentional desire to, dehumanize us, to make us the other, and so on. But in some cases, like the modern examples where I talk about histories written by well-meaning authors, some of whom I even know, and I've even had a conversation with, or somebody continues to refer to the Muslims as Moors, and I say to them, look, this is one of the ways in which you de-Islamize these spaces. The Moors is an archaic term, we don't need to use it no more, just call it Muslim space. The Alhambra is a Muslim space. It has Quran on it, for God's sake. We're not just talking about because Muslims live there. It has Quran. Over and over again, there are verses all over the place. And then it also has these incantations like Alhamdulillah, Inshallah, all of these all over the place. And that's their motto. Wala ghalib illallah. There is no victor except Allah. When the motto of the people who own it has Allah written in it, why are you trying to pretend this is anything but an Islamic space? So sometimes it's deliberate, like a reconquest narrative, like an anti-Ottoman. Of course, we know it's deliberate, there's no getting away from it. But the more recent ones, I think, is because of the unconscious bias that has developed. It's like me, trying to talk about women's issues. I've got no chance. Okay? I've got a natural blind spot. And my daughters are calling me out on it all the time. And that's great, because then I can be educated. So if you accept your blind spot, if you accept your unconscious bias, that's the first step. But at the moment, we're not willing to do that. As a society, we're not even willing to admit that this history has been warped. We're all just saying, no, this is it. This is the history. It's Judeo-Christian, and you Muslims.
Like, for example, just even people who are on the far right, and they say like send them all back and remigration. They don't even know like the basic history of why they're even in.
I think people like that. It's just they're done. We're not going to reach them. Let's be honest. The people we talk to are the people on the fence. The people who have been misled because either by design or accident, the history has presented itself to them in this way. That's the people you want to speak to. And of course, when you speak to those people, it has to come with gentleness. Because this is the other problem we have. Now, I know we're a predominantly Muslim audience here, which is probably why I'm being a bit harsher than I normally would be. But when I'm in, a literature festival or a history festival, I try to present this with gentleness because we all need to be gentle with our ignorances. Everybody has ignorances. Anybody that thinks the minute they don't have ignorances, we've lost them. Everybody has ignorances. I just explained to you my own in so many ways when it comes to, like I remember the first time my daughter and my wife was having a conversation about calling each other when they left a place to when they got home. This was news to me. My friends don't give a monkeys when I leave them. I'll be lucky if I get a message the next day to see if I'm alive. They don't care because we're men, we don't have to think about this. And I felt so ashamed in that moment. But how can I? Because, you can't take yourself out of yourself. And this comes back to the whole idea of being objective and everything else. None of us can be objective. It's impossible. But coming back to what you were saying, that people like that, they don't know the basics. So the fault isn't with them, almost. The fault is the system that they've been educated in. So even if we move away from Islam for a minute, these people don't even understand empire. When they're talking about repatriation, they're talking about repatriation. We're only here because you were there.
Exactly.
We wouldn't have come here, in all likelihood. And if we did, we probably would have come as an expat. Because that's okay, isn't it? You can come as an expat, because that's a different kind of immigrant. But if you come as an immigrant, we don't want you here. Now, why are we here? Anybody that studies empire, just a quick snapshot will tell you, we're only here because you were there and you destroyed what we had.
And continue to do so.
Yeah, when the first British ambassador turns up at the feet of the Mughal emperor, he is bowing to one of the richest leaders in the world. When they leave, India is a, quote-unquote, to use a colonial term, third world country. Why are we here? You need to read, you need to understand, but it's not their fault, it's not in our education. How can you teach British history and leave out empire? How can you do that?
It seems like even if you watch any war film,
yeah.
I don't know, like this famous World War I, World War II, trenches, like you'll never see a brown face or a black face.
Yeah, because that aspect of the army is...
And I knew like the same things, my granddad didn't fight for this or whatever. I'm like, yeah, so
did some of our granddads. Absolutely. Sorry.
I was just going to ask, just based on some of the themes, what other resources can we direct people to, of course, other than your book, Because, for instance, in the British Library, you have some really old manuscripts that were taken from the Muslim world that were actually labelled as waqf, which, as you know, in Arabic has a very special meaning, that is something communal. So if it's something communal, it can't be sold, it's for the community. So then how did it end up in the British Library?
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't, I think we can all take a kind of informed guess as to how most of these things ended up there, you know, because there was this company that was an honourable company, do you remember that?
Yes.
The Honourable East India Company. You see, this kind of propaganda, it was brilliant. And I remember recently reading inscriptions in a Quran that used to belong to Tipu Sultan in Dublin, Trinity College Library, and I was reading the inscriptions, and not only was it acquired by the Honourable East India Company, the honourable gentleman who acquired it gave it to another honourable gentleman. Now, if you're a lay person back in the day and you're reading this, you're thinking, these are great people. They're doing some good stuff here, you know, protecting all these manuscripts from these savages who probably have no idea what these things are anyway. You know, so how it ended up there, obviously, each one of these has a different story, and in some cases the story is almost impossible, but the reality is it obviously doesn't belong there. The Quran is something that is meant to be read. It's meant to be read every night if possible. It's meant to be experienced. It's meant to be immersed. It's not meant to sit behind a glass window so people can gawk at it like it's a piece of art. But until these things are fully appreciated, even coming back to the Burton example, one of the things that I did as part of that project, the project was aimed at decolonising. So it's about decolonising Richard Burton as a figure so that we can still engage with him without, you know, lauding him as something that was great or cancelling him completely, because that is also not useful. And I used one thing, I used the vehicle of the Hajj. Firstly, because it put him on the map, that's what made him famous. And secondly, because it's the one act that he engages in where there is no question he did something very wrong. He deceived an entire community of people, he disguised himself, and he went into a space that was excluded for him, right? It was the one piece of earth on the, one piece of land on the earth where it was basically saying, you can't come here. But when you have an imperial mindset, you don't care, okay? And so using that vehicle, the talks I gave, I would begin by first making clear just how deeply sacred the Hajj is. That it's not just any old pilgrimage. It's not a ziyarah like any other. This is the Hajj. It has its own proper noun for a reason. Okay? It is a rehearsal for death. It's an order from upstairs. So when you go around treating it like mere folly, something to mock even, to dress up and play games with, suddenly the audience was seeing it completely different. But the thing is, they'd never had that presented to them up to that point. And what was wonderful is, obviously, again, because of time, I took a lot longer to get to the points, and in a much more gentle way. Many of them came afterwards and thanked me because they'd never looked at it like that. They were just thinking, wow, another great conquest. Yes, another flag in the ground. You know, we've conquered something else. We've achieved something else. We've gone to the forbidden land. But it's sacred. You shouldn't be there. When I talk to primary school kids about Burton, they're like, no, he shouldn't have gone. They understand it because they haven't been walked. Their minds haven't been walked yet. They haven't been fed all this nonsense yet. And so if they can see it, we just have to find a way to make others see it. But when it's such a big thing, it's going to take a long time. Yes.
Tharik, lovely to meet you because you speak exactly as you write. Actually, you're very, you reach out to a great audience and you speak very plainly. Actually, just a comment though. I mean, I can't help but think there's a sinister sort of backstory here.
Yeah.
Because to your point, three earlier points. Number one, it just reads like a Daily Mail headline.
Yeah.
And I'm 49 years of age. I've lived in North West London all my life, but I feel as though every 5 years I'm justifying my existence.
Every 5 years, I do it every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes, I need to tell myself, I belong here because.
I just did it yesterday.
Absolutely. Quoting Judeo-Christian, that terminology did not exist up to 2 years ago. To your point, it was always Abrahamic, right? But that's the new term that I've happened to have got used to, right? But now we're fighting something very sinister in the sense that, and my take on it is, you're fighting billionaire money here.
Potentially, yes. But we always was. I mean, the Crusades were funded by people.
Absolutely.
You know, the Reconquest was funded by wealthy people.
But to a certain extent, you will always find perhaps maybe, well, if you're into conspiracies, maybe some sort of entity or, you know, governments talking to each other. But when you have individuals with a lot of money behind them pushing a narrative, that's even scarier.
Yeah.
Because it takes less coordination, quite frankly.
Yeah. No, I take your point.
And it's an individual's agenda that is being pushed.
Right. Yeah.
And that, I don't even know what to do. I mean, you've got billionaire Muslim money potentially.
Yeah.
You know, giving rise to Islamophobia. There was talk about UAE funding some think tank in Switzerland, trying to, like, you know, a PR company in Switzerland pushing out anti-Islamic narrative in the UK. I mean, what do you do in a climate like that?
Well, obviously, when I look at those things, I see history repeating itself. I don't actually see that much difference. I think there were the equivalent of billionaires funding those wars back then as well, funding those narratives, funding the normalization of those things back then as well. I think it's the same play sheet. Obviously, things are much more complicated with social media, damage is done quicker. Somebody like Trump knows he doesn't have to tell the truth anymore, because by the time anybody even works out it's a lie, which usually within a couple of seconds, it's the damage is done. Yeah. He knows. So these things complicate it, but ultimately the playbook is the same. The playbook is still the same, and the dominant the dominant narrative in the Western Hemisphere is one that has come and has been sourced from an anti-Muslim position, right? This is what it's built on. Now, even, like I say, even the well-meaning people still have to go back to certain sources, still have to go back to certain canonized takes on things and certain canonized perspectives. And when they go back, they then repeat some of that, even if they try to, because, of course, the arguments are so overwhelming now, it's very difficult to stand up and say anything. So for me, writing these kind of books is just really about sowing seeds. I don't know. I know I'm not going to change anything in my lifetime, because this has taken so long to get here. To undo it is going to take a millennia probably as well, if indeed it gets undone. And so we can only sow seeds and hope that those turn into, you know, the kind of great oak trees that we want. But this isn't going to go away overnight, for sure. But one of the ways that we can change it is by empowering the good people, because there are good people in every faith. Just like there are horrible people in every walk of life, every faith, every culture, there are also good people. You know, and if we can give the good people what they need to know, because now the war is information, right? It's a war of information. It's no longer a war on the ground. I mean, yeah, barring certain, well, that's not a war, we all know that. Okay, but the point being, the war is information. It's about who's at the top when you do that search. Yeah, in many ways. Or who is ChatGPT going to go to when it comes back and tells you it has some godly, divine knowledge? Because of course we don't even question that stuff anymore. And that's what the war is about. So you have to start putting what you believe to be the more honest, the more wider perspective on these histories into those spaces. So if you were to ask me, you know, like what should we do as a community, those that have money, or not, and when I say a community, I'm not talking about just Muslims, I'm talking about a community. We can talk about London here today because we're under siege at the moment. We can talk about Britain. What we need to do is invest in those spaces. Invest in the spaces that are trying to widen the narratives, that are trying to widen the perspectives, to trying to tell us these histories so that it doesn't stay warped.
Are there other questions?
It's a nicer question. What do you hope young Muslim readers take away from the book in terms of their place in European history?
Well, I hope they read, that's the first thing, because we have a problem there. Yeah, let's be honest, not just them, the adults are worse. They have to read because they go to school. We don't have to, so we don't. So the first thing is I hope they do read, but I also hope that some of them find anchorage through this, because a big part of anchoring our identities as human beings is done through things like heritage. So if we feel like we belong somewhere, it helps us to feel more at home. And anybody that's looked into, you know, what happens when certain individuals don't feel anchored to a place, it can be quite deadly. It can be quite dark. So when you look at a lot of Muslims that feel disaffected, detached from their homelands across Europe, and then you've got 1400-year history that they're not being given access to, that easily tells you that this is one of the ways that they would. There are millions of Muslims in Spain. There are millions of Muslims across Italy. Millions of Muslims across, all the entire continent. And this is their heritage. So hopefully it will help them feel rooted. But the second thing is, being young people, I hope they use this to then go on and create the kind of content that reaches a wider audience. Because although I write this book, as Nadia said at the beginning, to make it more accessible, nowadays most people don't even read. A book is seen as a dead weight in their bag. They don't want to carry that around. Fortunately, I've put it into audio, but who wants to live with this voice in their head for 8 hours, eh? So this is why I think it's really important that we all recognise we're part of a chain. In this day and age, a lot of influence takes place, we know, as social media. But those individuals have to go somewhere to get their knowledge and their information. And so I hope this is part of that, right? Because they're not going to be able to go all the way to the academics. And so I'm standing on the shoulders of those academics, maybe, and those historians, and then hopefully younger people can stand on mine.
You actually said in the book, when you were in Spain and you visited your cousin, and
yes.
there was a group of
first generation Bangladeshis.
Yeah, and they were like not interested
Nope.
at all in you saying, this European history has got there's Islamic heritage, and they were like, yeah, whatever, let's just talk about food. And but you said that's because they're not where you are. You are third generation.
Yeah, so I basically, what I said was, and that didn't bother me one bit, I expected it. They're first generation. They don't understand what I'm looking for because I'm their children.
So you said they're kids.
Yeah, I'm their children.
Care.
They don't look for belonging here. They know they belong in Bangladesh as far as they're concerned. In fact, the conversation quickly turned to, where I'm from, in which village, and who my uncles and aunts are, and then it was moaning about sending remittance. This is first generation problems. This is what they wanted to talk about. And I was happy to do that because I just wanted to have a nice curry with them. And it was a really nice curry. And we were having a great time. And to be honest, even when I met up with him, I didn't expect him to, but I thought, if I show him something, he might just mention it to his child one day, or he might just say it to somebody. And ironically, he was working in a bar called Al Mayrin, which is the original Muslim name for Madrid, when it was founded by Muslims. He had no idea, of course. When he took us to show us where he worked, I was like, oh my God, you work in somewhere that is using the original name of the actual city, because Madrid and Sarajevo are two of the European cities that were founded by Muslims. But it's his children.
Yeah.
It's for his children, because his children will claim they belong here. In other words, they will want to know what makes them feel more Spanish, what makes them feel more Iberian, what makes them feel more European, just like we do at the moment. So, yeah.
For me as well, when I found out more about this history, it helped me feel more like I belong. Otherwise, before you're facing a lot of turmoil, and you're getting it from all angles, like this anti-Muslim hatred, and things that aren't like direct either, it's subtly said. And there's a lot of children here today, which is really nice to see, because the more we know this and the more that we teach our children, it will help them to feel, I think, much more confident in themselves, which is really good. Did you have a question here?
Yeah. And then one over there.
There was one at the back.
Yeah, so you know how we mentioned that the Ottoman Sultan sent ships to Spain to rescue the Jews, but that would have also extended to the Muslims and the monotheistic Christians who were
whoever was on their way out. Yeah, but because I was talking about the Jewish narrative, that's why I mentioned it. Yeah, and apparently he was also laughing at the Spanish kings and queens for kicking them out, because he felt like wherever he would repopulate Jews, that area would flourish. Because he saw them as great tradespeople, great business people. So it wasn't just a purely, I'm a Muslim, sultan who's going to save all these. There was always other reasons for doing these things as well. So he reportedly laughs at the Spanish kings and queens, thinking, why would you kick these people out?
But I think they did also, they kept the children, isn't it? They mainly let the adults go.
Well, I think in a lot of cases they did, absolutely. And in some cases, when a conversion, when a Jew was forced to convert, like during the Visigothic period, the children were then taken away and given to a, let me try and remember the phrase, a trustworthy Christian family, or taken to a convent or something like that, where they could be raised as Christians, in case those pesky Jews go back to being Jews. That's the kind of horrific things that went down. So I think a lot of the time, that's exactly what happened. The children weren't.
So there was a question here, and then was there one at the back, and then we'll try and then the last one there, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
we'll come,
Actually, mine very glib questions, 3 very quick ones. Firstly, I mean, I don't know who your publishers were, but how to figure out was it to get a publisher?
Okay.
Secondly, and this is a very glib and facetious comment, have you decided, maybe thought of sending this book, a copy of it to Kemi?
To who?
Kemi, but I don't know.
I don't know who that is, sorry. I don't pay attention to nonsense.
And thirdly, I just wanted to know, in the book, do you actually discuss what it was about Islam, that has been so evidently historically threatening?
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I don't go into the theological discussions and that, because firstly, I'm not qualified. And secondly, this was more about talking about Muslim culture, not the religion. So I do need to be clear that I am not an Islamic scholar by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, so I don't go into the theological positions or anything like that. If I mention them, I mention them in passing. It was seen as a threat, as a territorial threat, as a civilizational threat. That's how it was perceived. And I don't go into the greatest of detail for that. In terms of getting it published, it was really off the back of the first book, because this is a major publisher, whereas the first book was a tiny travel guide brand label, who took a punt, because for them these things aren't a big risk, and it was very difficult to get that first book published. Very, very difficult. I nearly gave up. I wrote the book maybe 4 years before it got published, but I'd almost given up. And then through some networks I'd built, somebody was able to point me towards a mentor who helped me shape the proposal and then put it in front of some publishers. Just so happened she was also an agent, and so but a very lowly agent who had only contact within certain fields. So she went to I'm sure you all know Saki Books, Saki Books, people like that, and then travel labels. But the bigger ones, I don't know if she ever got it in front of them, but they clearly weren't interested. And ironically, after it published and ended up being long and shortlisted for awards, I would have conversations with them like, how did we not know about your first book? Because you don't see me down there, that's why. And so obviously, that's just the nature of the industry. That's how it happens, If somebody says something nice about you, if their voice is big enough, the other people hear it and so on. There's a degree of nepotism in all of these things. It's about who you know.
It's an arduous journey. Sophie, did you have one?
I just wanted to say thank you, Tharik. I find it is really inspiring to hear you talk about European history being Muslim history. And I was just going to touch on one of the other comments that they were saying about visiting Cordoba.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to give, it's not a question, I just wanted to add a few comments. That one thing that really inspired us is that our mother is my sister. She took us to Cordoba when I was about 14, 15, 16, before I met you. And it was really, when we were there, I remember just her reciting the Iqwan poetry to us.
Yeah, oh wow.
She told us all about the history of the Muslims in Spain and Europe and all the architecture. And she said, we will not leave here until we prayed our two.
Oh wow. So you managed to sneak it in.
So we were like, oh my God, my mum is on a covert. My dad was so embarrassed, and we took turns to watch each other. Security.
Just all standing around guarding. No, she's not doing anything. She just dropped her earrings.
What I wanted to say is that was really inspiring for me as her daughter, and at 15, and I'm a mother now. But at 15, that gave me such a strong sense of
rootedness.
I will be a Muslim regardless. And I think this concept is really, really important, and it's really nice to, when we say how can we counter all these concepts, and when we talk about identity, I think the most important thing is to center ourselves. The majority of the Muslims that I speak to do not even know this history. Now I travel with my kids. We went from Italy, from Napoli to Caprian Island, and we were walking around a really posh merchant's house with the guide telling us, and my kids recognized the word inshallah. When I asked the lady, what's that there? She said, it's just decoration.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to. So it is actually...
Or they genuinely don't know because they weren't taught it. I think some of them also, they weren't taught it properly, or they were taught it in a particular way. So
it makes you dubious. Do they know? Do they not? I don't know. But what it made me realize is that we have to educate
Well, that's a
And I
big
think
part of
this
it.
book
Yeah,
comes-
yeah. I think you're
When we
right.
talk about other people, I think this book is a real, it's an eye opener to all the countries in Europe which are affected by
Yeah,
Muslim history.
absolutely.
And that's our history.
And you're right in
See
that, we can sit here and obviously talk about, and a big part of my book is about why this history has been kept from us.
Yeah.
You can get all conspiratorial, or you can say it's just happened because that's the way, certain histories are written and whatever else. But then when the knowledge is presented, we as a community have a responsibility as well. You just have to look at the state of our madrasas and it explains a lot. Explains a lot. We don't even teach basic history in those
You've got
spaces
to do a
still.
few more sessions there. You can't have the summer off.
Yeah. I think my wife would leave me if I carried on like this.
You just got to whiz through
yes,
the last
yeah, a couple
few.
more
So
at the back.
Samia?
Yes, so thank you for being asked to talk on the history of Muslims in Europe. I wanted to ask, recently the Oxford Union has had documents released to ask Tommy Robinson, a far-right activist, in joining the debate on if the West is right to be suspicious of Islam.
Okay.
So do you think that educational institutions should be platforming figures like him and having him in these discussions?
Yeah, because if they do their job, they'll embarrass him. If this institute is worth anything, if it's worth its weight in whatever, right, then somebody like that should be terrified of walking into there, because then they should be able to put people in front of him that completely deconstruct the nonsense that he's probably going to spout. This is somebody who suddenly started calling himself a journalist. My God. As somebody who trained as a journalist, this was so insulting. And by the way, he's not the only one. There's random people walking around the globe with a camera calling themselves journalists now. The whole kind of profession has just been dragged through the mud. But if somebody like that goes to an institute like that, yes, I do want to see him debated in spaces like that. And if he thinks that, okay, now let's challenge it. And we should be able to challenge it. Obviously, we know that he's a person who clearly has built an entire career on peddling hate. That's quite apparent for us, but we're the community that is obviously intimately affected by this. But at the same time, to uphold our values as Brits or whatever, and to uphold the values of these institutes, then let these people put their case forward. And if anybody in that institute has any sense, then they will be able to put somebody in front of him who's able to make a nonsense of it.
Okay, thank you for that.
Right, so in an ideal world,
Yeah.
what rights would you like Muslims to have over the Alhambra?
Over the Alhambra, no rights.
No rights.
No, I don't think it's about reclaiming anything.
What's it about?
It's more about presenting the space in the more honest way. So presenting the history for what it really was.
But then can you not say that about Hagia Sophia?
Yes.
In Istanbul?
Yeah, absolutely.
But when you got there, if somebody goes to pray there,
Yeah.
they get straight away they get stopped.
Not
Yeah.
anymore. They've opened it now.
It's a
They
mosque
had it
again.
open,
No.
No, as a church.
Christian,
You're saying as a church.
If a
Yeah.
Christian goes there,
Absolutely.
they get stopped and they get apprehended.
Yeah. But I don't want to pray in the Alhambra.
You don't
No,
want to-
No, I don't want to pray in the mosque either. It's not a mosque anymore. I know you've told this wonderful story. I don't want to reclaim any of this. I just want the narrative to be presented more accurately and wholesomely. So I said to somebody recently, for example, I would love to read a book called Christian Arabia, for example. Okay? Because for me, I also have a problem with that. In that the entire narrative of the Middle East, I know it's a horrible term, the Middle East is dominated by an Islamic-centric version. Okay? So when I was trying to write, for example, the Lonely Planet Guide to Saudi Arabia, it was almost impossible to find the pre-Islamic heritage and artifacts of that space. So I have an issue with that as well. Now, I don't want to get into politics about whether or not Hagia Sophia should have been made a mosque or not. That's not what I'm here to discuss. I want these spaces to be presented in their true nature and their proper narrative, not warped. So something like the Alhambra, coming back to the original point you were making, when you present a space that was clearly not what you're saying it was, and it fits the horrific representation of Muslims as being sexually depraved, that's a problem for me. So I would rather the research was done properly. I would rather that when people are taken around, it's acknowledged that there is Quranic ayats on the thing. The Nazrid's motto itself shows reverence for God. There was a Mawlid that took place here. It was potentially on my third or fourth visit, I realised there was a mosque in the back. So my problem is how these spaces are being depicted. And you're right, away from Islam, if you look at other spaces, there's problems as well. Which is why I threw the El Transito synagogue into the mix. I want you to be clear that this isn't just about me trying to reclaim Muslim spaces. I'm trying to redress an imbalance. And that's why I focus on the Islamic. I hope other people can come and do the same for Christian heritage, for Jewish heritage. We know people like David Olusoga are doing a great job with black history. We've seen Satnam Sangera write a great book about Empire Land. This needs to be done in all these arenas. But it just so happens that obviously right now, you and I both know, the Muslim community in the West feels like it's under siege.
Yeah.
And so that's why obviously, you know, as a Muslim, this is the one that is most pressing for me on a personal level. But yeah, I totally understand why Christians would be upset that they can't go to the Hagia Sophia, one of the most important places of Christendom. And I'm going to be transparent. I know that was a political move. All of these things are political moves. But it's us little people on the ground that suffer with it. So, yeah.
So, because we want to give time for Tharik to do some book signings, we'll just do one really, really quick question, please.
Okay. Thank you again, Tharik, for your interesting presentation. But I just wanted to ask about, of course, I agree with you fully about what you're saying about reclaiming the space and the real history. But how do we balance between what we need to hear about this history and to claim it and find our space here, between also being critical of it, also our own history? How do you do that? Because sometimes it feels that we're just looking at everything good.
No, you can't romanticize it.
The challenges.
No, you can't romanticize it. And in this discussion, it may feel like that because the book is written to redress an imbalance. So somebody commented under one of my, I can't remember what it was, a post or a book, and they said, why don't you talk about all the horrific things they did here and they did there and they did there? I'm like, there's 1,400 years of literature written on that. The reason you're able to point them out is because it's in the public domain. Even somebody like you, who probably doesn't have 2 brain cells to knock together, can access this. So I don't need to write about that. Sometimes when an imbalance happens, the only way to try and redress that is you have to come with a heavy counterweight. So a lot of the things that I don't mention in here that are problematic from a Muslim perspective, history perspective, which I am completely on board with because there was some horrific things going on. Like even the Reconquista narrative, there's this version where it's galvanized. The Matamoros mythology becomes almost national because Al-Mansur goes and smashes up Santiago de Compostela. That's horrific. It's disgusting. Why do you need to go and do that? You know, he may have his own reasons and whatever coming back to it, but I would never look at that and say that's a positive thing. You know, but the negative elements of this history, believe me, if there is anything negative in this history, it has been magnified. It has been made, like I said, there was a golden age, was there? But they were second-class citizens, and they had to pay the jizya, and they were dhimmis, you know. Everything is underplayed at best. And when it can't be, if more can be done, it's been done. So this is about redressing an imbalance. But anybody who reads it will see, I am not sitting there just waving the flag that Islam is the best and Muslim culture. I'm not saying that at all in the book. And anybody that's read it will see that. Obviously in the discussion, it can come across different because we're trying to present those elements. But we have to have clarity with our own history. Muslims have a huge problem with our history when it comes to that. You know, I think it's Hamza Yusuf that said, you know, that when you first start looking at history, you have to take a big dose of iman. Because when you start reading how horrific we were, our first 4 caliphs were murdered. Okay, there's nothing, you know, it was born into a bloodbath almost, and maybe that's why it lent itself to others then looking in and saying, oh yeah, maybe that's how they expanded the faith, by the sword and what have you. So we have some horrific aspects to our history without any shadow of a doubt, and we shouldn't gloss over them, we shouldn't romanticize them, just in the same way as I'm saying to, I don't know, a Eurocentric post-Christian narrative that you can't gloss over this. You can't hide the fact that Muslims were here, even if you don't like it. The same needs to be said about some of our Muslim histories.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Just to finish to say, I think the point you made about the difference between Christendom and Christianity is a really important point. Yeah. I think that's a really
most people don't understand the difference.
The other thing is, we shouldn't gloss over the bad parts of our history, but there were good things as well, and there were things that lasted centuries. For example, in Sicily and Malta, we were only there for quite a short time relatively, yet the heritage and cultures lasted. And I think it's important that when we speak about it, then people will challenge us and say, oh, you know, you're just making everything look good. But anything you say about Muslims, you know, certain people's perception is you're just trying to exaggerate, because people will always come with the negative. What about this barbaric thing, or the harems, or the women, or all of that? So it's also important to try and speak positively where we can about it. Time has flown, and thank you all for your participation, for your attendance. We would like to give some time to Tharik. Has some books to sell, and he will sign them, so if you've got more questions and he's not too tired, he can answer them. There's also, please stay in a network, and there's refreshments on the side. I'd like to thank the Maqam Centre again for opening their doors, and a massive thank you to Tharik for coming all the way. And so I do regular events like this, so as I said before, if you want to keep informed, you can just sign up to my newsletter over there. There's the QR code. And thank you once again for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.